Welcome, everyone, to this meeting on platforms and cultural production. And I'll start by sharing my slides, and then I'll start the opening presentations. So I'm Thomas Poel. I'm professor of data, culture and institutions at the University of Amsterdam, and I will introduce this meeting and also chair the panel conversation and discussion with you. The central question of today is how do platforms reshape the cultural industries? And I will discuss this together with David Nieborg, who have written the book, which you can see on the left side of your screen. With David is assistant professor of media studies at the University of Toronto. And our other co-author, who unfortunately can't be here today, is Brooke Aaron Duffy, who is associate professor at Cornell University in the US. We will discuss this book, which inspired this meeting, together with Anne Helmond, who is a colleague of mine at the University of Amsterdam, assistant professor of new media and digital culture, as well as with Jeroen de Kloet, who is a professor of globalization studies, also at the University of Amsterdam. So this is the program of today. We will start with an introduction when I'll talk you through sort of what the main topics of the book are, and especially what the main arguments of the book are. Subsequently, we'll turn to the panel conversation, in which we've asked Anne and Jeroen to respond to the book, asking questions, provoking us to share our thoughts on the central themes of the book. And we will start with a reflection on platform economics and infrastructures, and subsequently turn to the question of global diversity in platforms and cultural production. Around 6 o'clock, we will discuss questions and remarks from you. Hopefully you have some. With the panel, and you can share any ideas you have, any questions, remarks in the chat throughout this introduction, as well as during the panel conversation. So I will be following the chat and will be collecting questions, which I'll then share with the panel. So let's turn to our book, which we started writing about 3 years ago, and it took us about 1.5 years to write. One first draft in about a year writing, and then a subsequent 8 months of rewriting the book. So what are we talking about when we say cultural production, platforms, and platformization, which are some of the central terms which we use in the book? Now, of course, when thinking about platforms and culture producers, we can think about the game industry. So what happens to game producers when they choose to create, distribute, market, and monetize games through platforms, such as, for example, in the case here, the Apple App Store? How does this affect the game industry, which historically has been, and this is a central term we use in the book, has always been platform dependent, but historically on other types of platforms. So you can, for example, think about the Sony PlayStation or the Xbox. And recently we've seen new digital platforms emerge, such as the Apple App Store, but also Facebook as an important platform for distributing, but also monetizing games. Platform dependent, by the way, means that a culture producer is dependent on the platform for creating, distributing, marketing, and monetizing content and services. Well, this kind of dependence you can also see in other types of media or cultural industries, such as new industry segments, which in this case is called social media entertainment. How do creators, such as the Dutch makeup artist and beauty vlogger Nikki de Jager, work through major platforms? So the creator economy has basically grown up around these platforms, around YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Twitch. And in this sense, you can also say that this industry can be understood as platform dependent. This is quite different in the case of the news industry, which historically has been, of course, platform independent. Newspapers and television stations, in a way, can be understood as platforms, or historically could be understood as platforms in their own terms, which connect different sites in a market to each other, so readers and advertisers. Yet, recently, news publishers have increasingly started to distribute news content and monetize this content through platforms. Especially Facebook has been very central, making them dependent on platforms which they do not control, right? Which raises all sorts of questions, which we discuss in the book. Similar observations can be made about record labels that historically connect musicians with listeners. With the digitization of music distribution and the rise of platforms such as Spotify or Apple Music, we can see that also music distribution, marketing, and monetization becomes organized through platforms. So these are the some of the central fields we discuss in our book, and we think about these in terms of a process of platformization. So the interaction between platforms and these types of cultural producers generates a process in which some of these producers more, and in some cases less, become dependent on platforms. In the context of cultural production, we define this particular process as the penetration of a digital platform's economic, infrastructural, and governmental extensions into the cultural industries, as well as the organization of cultural practices of labor, creativity, and democracy around these platforms. And if you look at this definition, you can also, if you've seen our book, recognize the chapters of the book in the definition. So the first part of the definition is basically covered or explored in the first half of the book, where we look at the markets, the infrastructures, and the governmental frameworks of cultural production through platforms. And in the second half of the book, we turn to the cultural practices of labor, creativity, and democracy, and how they unfold and take shape through platforms. So what are platforms then? This is something we've been extensively discussing when writing this book. What does it mean in the context of cultural production? So building on a variety of fields. So this has been a question in the field of business studies, in political economy, but also in software studies. We have defined platforms as data infrastructures, very much referring to this field of software studies, that facilitate, aggregate, and monetize and govern interactions between end users, content, and service providers. So here again, you can see this idea of platforms, or the notion of platformization, as something that involves infrastructures, data infrastructures, that involves economic relations or markets, so facilitate and aggregate and monetize. And then finally, that also involves a form of governance. It governs, platforms govern interactions between end users and service providers. So to make it a bit more sort of concrete, if we look at YouTube as a platform, it's evidently a platform. We can see that it constitutes a market, and one that aggregates and monetizes interactions among content creators, such as Nicky de Jager, advertisers, and end users. So the billions of users or viewers use YouTube daily. These interactions are in turn afforded by YouTube's data infrastructure, which allows creators to upload content, but also allows advertisers to target users with particular advertisements. This is an infrastructure and a market that's radically open, and that idea of openness is very important in our book. So the idea that everyone who wants to share something through a platform, in principle, is able to do so. This is quite different, obviously, from the kind of gatekeeping practices you can see on in legacy media companies, such as newspapers, for example, or record companies. This brings us then to the dimension of governance. YouTube also tries to organize the ways in which people share content through the platform. It's radically open, but at the same time, there are always moments of control. It attempts to control and standardize the kinds of interactions that happen through the platform. So YouTube, for example, provides terms of service, creator guidelines, developer documentation, and it also stipulates who has access to what tools and which data through its infrastructure. So those issues are covered in the first half of the book. In the second half of the book, we think about platforms in terms of labor, creativity, and democracy. The platforms allow culture producers, cultural workers to find new avenues to audience and to visibility. But just as traditional labor markets in the cultural industry, and of course also in other labor markets and other sectors, labor is also characterized and continues to be characterized by precarity and inequalities in terms of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and so on. And while platforms regulate, they also produce new genres. There are places of creativity, obviously, as you all know. There's every so many months a new genre appears to emerge. But those creative processes are always at the same time being controlled and filtered by the platform, privileging particular forms of cultural expression. And finally, platformization opens up new spaces of contestation and cultural diversity, but simultaneously enhances problems of discrimination, hate, and disinformation, undermining democratic politics. So what we're, as you can hear, trying to do is showing, on the one hand, that platforms allow for all sorts of things to happen, both in terms of new forms of labor, new forms of creativity, new democratic relations, but at the same time, control these processes in ways that are not always in correspondence with the ways in which we would ideally envision cultural production to take place. So this then leads us to the argument of the book. So what are we arguing about these emerging relations between platforms and culture producers? Before I take you through some of the main arguments in the book, let me just say what we're not arguing. So what we're not arguing is that platformization of platforms radically change the prevailing power relations within the cultural industries. So instead, what we're witnessing are more the intensification of long-term trends, problems, and tensions in the cultural industries that for a major part actually predates the emergence or rise of Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and so on. What we're also not arguing is that this process of platformization is uniform, that it takes place everywhere in the same way. But what we do demonstrate is that how similar mechanisms, so economic mechanisms, infrastructural relations, governance frameworks set out by platforms are everywhere negotiated, adopted, and rejected in different ways across industry segments, so across the different segments I just mentioned, and there are many more, and around the globe. Okay, so what do we argue then? So one of the questions we've been struggling with or grappling with is this question of decentralization and centralization. What happens to the cultural industries once these platforms become very central? Does this mean that we can see an emancipation of the individual culture producer, or do we actually see that these relations become more and more centralized? So if you look at platforms, often the suggestion has been made that they indeed emancipate individual creators, journalists, game developers, and musicians, and emancipate them from these traditional media companies that have always dominated these various industries. So newspaper or big publishers, music labels, game publishers, and so on. So, but whether such a transfer of power actually takes place is very much the question. What we observe throughout the book is what we call blockbuster dynamics would actually reward a relatively small number of winners or stars. And what we actually see is that many of the sort of legacy media companies I just mentioned are actually reaffirming their position in a platform economy. So particularly transnational media conglomerates such as Walt Disney, which you can see here on the image, have a huge advantage in terms of capital, ongoing institutional relations, brand, the well-knownness of their brand, and the skills they have in-house in terms of working with platforms, much more so than individual producers or newcomers. So even though we often hear of individual creators that sort of strike it big and have a lot of success, what we those are overall, they tend to be the exception rather than the rule. What we see instead is more of a consolidation of traditional power relations in the media industry. But this is obviously something of a question which we can discuss in the panel conversation. So besides this consolidation of power relations in the media industry, what we see at the same time is the role of the platform. The platform not just enables all of these different actors to distribute their content, but obviously, as I mentioned a couple of times already, they also control these kinds of interactions through a wide range of governing instruments. Which means then that if you look at these kinds of connections, they all will always be moderated, will always be shaped by the platform, which thus means that platform-dependent industry segments, we can also see a centralization of infrastructural and political power on the part of the platform company. So sort of a dual process we see unfolding here. A concentration of economic power in a number of large media companies that have learned how to work the platform ecosystem, and at the same time a centralization of infrastructural and political power on the part of a number of large platform companies. And this is an issue that doesn't get enough attention in our mind. These relations between platforms and cultural producers are especially precarious on the part of cultural producers because platforms tend to change very quickly, change their infrastructures and their regimes of visibility, constantly adapting, altering their algorithms and their access to their application programming interfaces, so to the data they share with external partners. We have framed this incessant shift as platform evolution, which is actually a term that's also used by colleagues in business studies and in software studies. As we've emphasized throughout the book, small changes in platform governance can have a significant economic and cultural impact. So platform-dependent culture producers constantly have to adapt to these kinds of changes, which makes it very difficult to build a sustainable business. So these are the core arguments in the first half of the book. And then in the second half of the book, we look at how these processes of labor, creativity, and democratic practices take shape in this interaction between platforms and culture producers. And what we see is what stands out is that platformization has intensified structures of worker individualization. So individualization is obviously a theme that is a process that occurs in a much broader sense in contemporary economies, but it's intensified by platforms. So here again, you can see that broader economic and cultural and social shifts are often ongoing for a longer period of time, but are often then intensified or shaped in particular ways by the platform. Platforms systematically deflect, as you know, responsibility for labor. They do that in all sorts of markets, but they also do so in the cultural industries by positioning themselves as intermediaries rather than as employers. So platform companies thus avoid legal obligations that characterize traditional employer-employee relations. And this economic configuration is often legitimized by claims of economic freedom and flexibility. But obviously, this also means that those who are working as independent freelancers are often insecure and in a vulnerable position. To remain relevant on platforms, individual culture producers and also organizations are expected to constantly pursue likes, shares, and so on. This connects to the theme of commercialization of culture production, which of course is also an ongoing theme. Across platforms, data-driven advertising has been fundamentally integrated in every aspect of cultural production. So even though often the emphasis is on the authenticity of the cultural content that is shared, in fact, often it's tightly integrated with advertising. So you can think, for example, about seamless integration of commercial messages in live streaming, or the ubiquity of native advertising in platform-based news production. And then finally, we've observed how platform-dependent culture production reflects existing societal biases and inequalities. And we've been thinking about this in terms of visibility and invisibility. Platform-dependent culture producers, even those that are highly visible from a socio-economic perspective, such as, for example, successful influencers, tend to be politically invisible, lacking legal and regulatory support. So the absence of these kinds of protections again renders workers further autonomized and precarious. So these are some of the themes which are at the center of the second half of the book. So this, of course, is a brief introduction of the main themes and arguments. Within the overall book, what we try to do is devote a lot of attention, not just to the industry segments I've highlighted before, so gaming, news production, social media entertainment, but also to a variety of others. But also we've tried to look at the variety in terms of geographic and cultural regions. So besides the US and European examples, we extensively discuss Chinese-based platform companies and practices of cultural production. And in doing so, we also try to consider each political and cultural region as distinct. So moving away from this idea that the US is the standard trajectory of platformization. Throughout the book, we've emphasized that no case study can be representative for the entire cultural industry or even for a particular segment. Our conceptual framework, initially what we hope, enables individual scholars to reflect on the specificity of their case, and then collectively, hopefully, engage in an active dialogue across these different fields of study on cultural production, as well as geographic regions. So if you're working, and I know that there are quite a few colleagues in this Zoom meeting, so if you're working on these issues and are doing research in this field, we're organizing a conference next year in June, so June 1 and 2, 2022, here in Amsterdam on global perspectives on platforms and culture production. The call for papers is online, so you're very welcome to submit a paper to this conference. And what I want to do now is turn to the other speakers in this meeting and turn to the panel conversation. And what we'll start with is our questions on platforms, economics and infrastructures. And I've asked Anne to give a first response to the book. And she already told us that she's going to ask a question. So we'll hear from Anne first.
Hi, so thank you so much for inviting me to this wonderful event of the recently published book on platforms and cultural production, or should I say will be published book, because it's actually dated in 2022. So that was an interesting find, that it's a future-oriented book. And also, just referring to the platforms of the past, behind me you see old-fashioned oil rigs, which are considered traditional production platforms, where we can also maybe in the future discuss the distinction between the value of oil and data within this platform economy. But first of all, congratulations to the authors on this publication, where Thomas, David, and Brooke provide a very rich overview of the platform studies literature originating from different disciplines, including business studies, software studies, media industry studies, critical political economy, to examine this role and power of platforms within the cultural industries. And they do so by focusing on what they call the institutional actors, so not the consumers of cultural content, but actually the producers of cultural content, across what they call various stages of cultural production, involving the creation, distribution, marketing, and monetization of content. And in doing so, they draw from a rich set of examples from the game industry, social media, and news industry, where they aim to create a framework to understand how platforms affect or reconfigure these stages of cultural production. So as a brief introduction for those who don't know me, I'm also a very active platform studies scholar, studying platforms, platform evolution, platformization, and APIs extensively in the past decade, also including with David Nieborg, Fernando van der Vlist, Esther Weltevrede, Caroline Gerlitz, and others. So it was also a pleasure to read this book, and I formulated as, kind of like opening up the discussion about these important topics to some lengthy academic questions. So in the tradition of asking a question, it's a lengthier one, inviting the authors to reflect and to expand on their arguments made in the book, to further also introduce you, the audience, to the book and its topics. So my first question would be, if you could further reflect on the various types of cultural producers in the book and how their work is affected by platforms, especially then in relation to platform infrastructures and the platform economy at large. So let me explain what I mean with this question. So in your book, you touch on this very fuzzy boundary between amateur and professional content producers, while one might also argue that in practice, many platforms themselves clearly distinguish between the two, or maybe even multiple types of content producers, by offering, for example, very regular upload possibilities on YouTube and TikTok for amateurs, where you just click a button and upload your video, to more, maybe they're very often called creator studios, which then labels these cultural producers not as, individual content producers, but as creators, which is kind of a new label then being introduced. To also these very extensive software development kits offered to more what we could then call, what Nieborg and van der Vlist and I have called previously, more these professional content creators, where these software development kits also allow you to, for example, build your own Snapchat lens. So that's a very different type of content creator, if you will, than someone who produces a Snapchat video. The same goes for TikTok, YouTube, and these other platforms. So these products also maybe address a particular level of expertise, or maybe a different scale of professionalism. So the questions that follow from that, and let's see which ones you find interesting to take up, but how do these platforms steer the creative expression of these different types of producers, in a different way? Because you also, for example, discuss how what is called boundary resources, so tools and explanations for building new products on top of platforms, enable the infrastructural integration with platforms, where the question is to what extent this pertains to all types of cultural producers, or whether this is only, happens by these professional content producers. So how is this integration into these platforms operationalized maybe differently by these different levels or hierarchies of cultural producers? And following also from that, if content production or cultural content production in this case depends on the use of these products such as APIs and SDKs, what does it mean when these products, when APIs and SDKs change? So what then happens to the cultural production? And in the context of platform economics, and this is also where one of the slides of Thomas come in, we can maybe observe a blurring, a kind of further blurring between commercial and non-commercial content production, especially when we're talking about influencers, for example, where the idea of the so-called creator economy may also signal a further commercialization of culture. So the open question is then, to what extent can we still speak of cultural production, or should we rather speak of commercial production? And what are the consequences of these blurring boundaries when talking about platformization in the context of cultural producers? What then would be the difference between the platformization of the cultural industries and the commercialization of these cultural industries? And the final open question that I want to pose is, to what extent the work here is generalizable beyond the cultural industries? For example, what insights can researchers gain to study or understand maybe the transportation sector or education sector, so other types of sectors and industries affected by these processes of platformization? Because in your analysis, and this is also what you point out yourself, and which I know you acknowledge that you focus on these kind of big tech platforms, but of course there's also many other types of platforms within this industry which become part of this giant ecosystem that these cultural producers are embedded in. So if you're drawing from your analysis and the framework, what does it mean for platforms beyond big tech? So how can we use this framework for platforms beyond big tech? Do they show the same dynamics, for example, that you document? And can we even imagine, or are there even examples of alternative content creation platforms that are not connected to or that engage with big tech? And what forms of cultural production do they enable, or what do they imagine, and how could we learn from them in their use? So once again, thank you for the opportunity to comment on some of the core themes of this book, and I'm looking forward to the further dialogue.
Great. So indeed, these are very interesting questions, and we feel a bit like we're indeed in a PhD defense, where we've written something and now we get the hard questions. So thank you, Anna, for these. So I'll first give the floor to David.
Yeah, I feel the same way, but in the best of way. Thanks, Anne. This is great. These are some great questions. I feel like with every one of those sort of sub questions, we talked about this among the three of us for like days or weeks or months. So in a way, that gives me a lot of confidence to be able to answer this. On the other hand, you opened not a can of worms, but so let me try to pull them apart. That first question of, where's the dividing line between an amateur and a professional, and for profit or not for profit? And very early on, we tried to stick with, also for the sake of consistency, to stick with the language of cultural production, because it has such a good, long intellectual, theoretical tradition, rather than make the argument even more fuzzy and complicated by, let's introduce even more new terms of who these people are. So we try to sort of stick with traditional notions of who are in the cultural industries, what do they do. That's part of it. My sense about how sort of platforms hail those who produce, I do think that when it suits them, they're very specific into, oh, these are creators, meaning cultural producers, meaning for-profit actors. And in many other instances, these are, just consumers or just end users. I think in most instances, if you look at very specific, mostly the social media, TikTok, Instagram, that these platform subsidiaries, if we want to be slightly more specific, I get the sense that there is not somebody sitting at Google HQ or Facebook HQ thinking about these questions like, who are these people? I think these are all very much, as you are very well aware of, automated systems, and they simply do not care what the content is. I constantly see examples of, we aggregate as much content as possible, and whether it's like hardcore for profit or super amateurish, as long as it's popular, as long as it generates engagement and clicks and views. I think that's from the platform side the most important. So that's part of the answer. If you start going to specific examples, this starts to break down again a little bit, because as you noted, there are hierarchies. Right? So I did a class recently where we talked through the YouTube rules of engagement, so to say, and there are hierarchies. You need so many views. You need there are barriers to entry, and there, especially YouTube, I think, is an interesting case, and that's why part of the reason we started the book with YouTube, because it has in a way a longer history than, let's say, TikTok and Instagram, where they have been thinking through this. And I've had these conversations a lot also with my colleagues in business studies, because they always talk about quality content. And when you ask an economist about quality content, what that means, and I don't mean to be too harsh on them, that's too easy, but it helped me understand better how economists and maybe those working at platforms or working for platforms think about what content is. For us, I think in media cultural studies, we have a sort of a very sort of elevated sense of what it should be. Right? It should be diverse, it should be meaningful, it should be democratic, etc. We have all these sort of lofty ideas. But then if we had these conversations with folks working in the business or working for platform companies, it's about quality content. What is quality content? Quality content is that content that generates attention. So it's sort of a circle argument, right? Good content is content that is good because it's good because it resonates with a lot of people. And then the argument is like, especially platform algorithms, of course, boost and highlight that. So I think in many instances, we see content elevated, this question of visibility, that may come out of any place, but the systems are set up that, let's tomorrow I make a fantastic video of a puppy, it generates an insane amount of engagement. Then the question for me becomes, because I'm in such a commercial environment, do I want to monetize this? Or I just, do you want to leave money on the table? So, I think that's part of the question, is that because you're in this, like you're saying, commercial environment, sort of the barrier, the inclination to veer towards professionalism or making some kind of revenue is high. So I think it's both. Right? Platforms, I don't think there's so many examples that they do not care necessarily where content is coming from, as long as it generates popular engagement. Whereas people on the ground or doing the actual work, the producers, care, of course, very deeply about it. So I'm almost want to say, like, I didn't answer the last part of your question, but we can come back to that perhaps in a second. But I'm curious if you agree or disagree with this, Anne.
So I would say the platforms maybe do care where content comes from, by especially making these distinctions, because if you look at, for example, these platforms, they also offer all kinds of training programs, right? So there are all of these guidelines of how to make your content better. So they are highly concerned actually with the quality of the content and offering specific guidelines to specific user groups. So in a way, I would argue that they do care where it comes from. And then by distinguishing between these different users, also offering different handles to make this content visible, or to increase these dynamics that you speak of, to actually, similar tools you also discuss in the book, like old strategies of search engine optimization, right? It's almost like it's not only social media optimization, like how to write a good title for your TikTok, or it's also about how to use the right filter. There are these very streamlined guidelines helping these various levels of content creators to create this to create this content. So I would almost say that they do care where it comes from, because then they can steer how it's.
You're sorry to interrupt you. Absolutely, but there's like they do care about the quality, but then the question becomes, what does quality mean, right? So they want quality content, and at certain points in the book we say, I think we argue that they are inherently conservative in their outlook on what quality content is. Anything that is slightly deemed offensive, whether in the US or China, is sort of pushed to the side. So I think there's a very conservative tendency, which is, you can translate that as risk averseness or to legal mitigation strategies. And we've seen that in the sort of old school cultural industries, right? So this is not one of those new things. But when we start talking about quality, they do care about quality. What quality means for a platform versus a cultural producer versus, maybe if I can say, us media scholars. Those are very different understandings of the word quality, and what an amateur is and what a professional is. Those are sort of very different and loaded questions.
Can I maybe just briefly jump in here? And I think I fully agree with actually what both of you are saying, but I think that sort of goes to the central issue or central dynamic we've tried to show in the book, is that these things are very much negotiated, right, between a variety of actors, the ways in which the quality of content or the importance of content is considered as an ongoing process, right? So on the one hand, we can see that platforms obviously would like to see content that generates engagement, that keeps users on the platform. But at the same time, they also have to keep advertisers in mind, right? So the concerns of advertisers. And in that process of what we call the process of negotiation, I think they end up somewhere, right, where they're trying to sort of balance out all of these different concerns. And in doing so, indeed, they tend towards, or they go towards the conservative side of the equation. And they do care about what type of content it is, precisely for the reason I just mentioned. But the types of concerns are obviously quite different from those that are the concerns of culture producers themselves, right, who want to express themselves. And so that friction is something we're very interested in. The friction between the platform, the culture producer, the advertiser, and so on. So I think, you raise a very interesting question, which I think we've tried to grapple with in the book, but it's not there's no simple answer, I think, to this question.
No, and I think what you point to, Anne, as well, is that it's also at the point of the boundary resources of the tools, right? And you've done a lot of work on this as well, is that how do those tools structure and those workshops by YouTube and those creator rooms and academies and developer communities and events and all that developer documentation, they're very, guiding, like you say, steering creators in a certain direction. And I think part of the answer to these questions is there, like, how do platforms see those people and folks, and where do they advertise them? And I think this is one of the, like Thomas is saying as well, sort of the gaps. There is scholarship on this, but this is one of the areas where I hope the next couple of years, 3-5 years, there's much more scholarship on this question. You've explored this more on sort of the infrastructural side and the technical side, but this hard question, right? This sort of the soft question, the cultural question of, like, how do these tools, what kind of genres do they sort of maybe implicitly, indirectly boost? And you see that a little bit with games as well, right? In the app space, it went seemingly overnight from the premium business to the free-to-play business. And now we're questioning, or not we, but we academics and industry insiders are questioning, what did that bring us? Our free-to-play games, because it has such a deep impact on how you experience games and how they're made and how they're developed. So that ability to create free-to-play games comes out of the platform, right? So they set the parameters for that business model. So that's a rich case study. And I think these days, many game critics will say, it would have been nice if there was an alternative to the free-to-play business model, because it generates certain games that not everybody might be happy with. But you do see it has a very sort of structuring, steering effect. I do want to come back.
Yeah, I know you want to come back to the other question as well, but I'm also looking a little bit of time. We're now at 5:45, and we can continue this discussion later. I'm also seeing that there are quite a lot of comments already in the chat, which we'll come back to after 6. Just one of them I want to mention. David Craig, a colleague from US, suggests that maybe in this quality debate, perhaps brand safe comes closer to your concerns rather than quality as a term. But maybe we can return to this after the second part of the discussion. I would like to give the floor to Jeroen, who will raise some issues around the global diversity and democracy, which we also discuss in our book.
Yeah, thanks so much, Thomas and David, for inviting me. It's really great. I see also in the participants quite a lot of people I know, and I also know that the Pool family is watching one floor higher on a big screen to this. So let's wave at the Pool family. Okay, so for the coming 10 minutes, I have divided actually my comments in 4 parts. The first is an anecdote, then I have a celebration, then I have a detour to a hobby horse of me. That's what hobby horses are for. You always get on them. And I have a very few questions. I don't have so many questions, actually. So first, the anecdote. Allow me to start with a memory. It was the Olympic year of 2008, and that time I was living in Beijing. And then I remember how activists used Twitter, at that time still available in China, to unveil the so-called black prisons. So these are illegal prisons often used against petitioners who appeal against the party, because you can appeal against the party, it's just dangerous. And Twitter allowed, and in these days I believe we should now say afforded, activists to post images of these secretive prisons. And I was thrilled at that time, I still remember. I realized how this real-time posting, including the location, this would and should present a predicament that is impossible to silence. It would really alter the power game between the people and the party. It would, I felt, be a new chapter in citizen journalism, producing a more open media sphere in China, 2008. I was just wrong on so many accounts, right? After reading this wonderful book by Thomas, David, and Brooke, published 14 years later, I realized I was not just wrong, I was also terribly naive. I was naive about the institutional workings of a platform like Twitter, as I was wrong about the promise of, say, democracy, the promise that you also sort of engage with in the book. In the decade that followed, we have witnessed the rapid growth of these platforms, also in the cultural sector, leaving both governments as well as academics behind, rather puzzled and baffled. How to think of microcinema, of songs we get to know through platforms, or news, fake or not, that we read time and again on our mobile phones. So this was the anecdote. It really cued me back to Beijing 2008 and my own naivety. And the book, I think, really presents a wonderful framework to think what's going on. So the celebration then, the second part. To me, the book presents a really convincing and urgent framework to grasp the changes that we have witnessed and are witnessing in the global cultural sector. Thomas already explained the rationale of the book. But one sentence on page 180 I thought was really nice because it so much summarizes the approach. The book offers a holistic approach that shows how institutional changes in markets, infrastructures, and governance are fundamentally entangled with shifts in cultural practices of labor, creativity, and democracy. Now, voila. There you have the 6 terms that make up the 6 chapters of the book. And now to me, actually holistic often sounds a bit, what shall I say, esoteric. It reminds me of candles and incense, right? A sort of vagueness, as if you don't dare to make a decision. But here it truly works in the book. The authors are really quite, and luckily quite, or profoundly promiscuous when it comes to their sources that range from cultural studies to business studies to political economy to software studies and so on. One take that I also particularly liked is the attempt to avoid platform essentialism, which makes that the book steers away from a singular media-centric approach. something we quite often actually see in media studies, that everything seems to revolve around media, but life is so much more. So why this book is so important in my view is that it's the first that truly presents a model to study platforms and cultural production. As such, it builds on numerous empirical studies, but it does something much more than presenting a study. It presents a new approach, a highly comprehensive way to study platform cultures. So it not only presents taking stock of what has been done, but it goes further. It's theoretically innovative and presents multiple research avenues towards the future. So, of course, then the conclusion of my celebration part is buy this book. And on top of that, it's also highly readable. It's not too jargonized, which I like. Okay, third, the detour to my hobby horse. Well, people who know me know which horse that would be. The book stands out in one other aspect. It's one of the very few books that includes many examples from places like China and Southeast Asia. The authors clearly make an attempt to present a truly global perspective, and do so arguing for a sensitivity of local specificities without falling in the trap of, say, a Chinese kind of exceptionalism. So it's not like, oh, China is unique and very special. And no, Chinese platforms are presented alongside other platforms and used to discuss their specificity, but also what they share. Now, both communication studies as well as media studies, but also other fields like philosophy or cultural studies, are, to say it blunt, incredibly Euro and Anglo-centric. It are always Western theories that are used to discuss Western cultural forms, reproducing a world in which we all know who Lady Gaga is, but we don't know who Deng Lijun is, in which we are familiar with Twitter, but hardly have a clue of Weibo. So what we consequently do in front of a very international student body is reproducing a world in which the West is and remains the best, to paraphrase Jim Morrison, and the rest at best serves as an empirical case to test Western theory. And this actually, I think, is becoming increasingly scandalous, particularly that it's so difficult to change. But then this book does something different. It brings in other examples without claiming them to be truly unique. It unpacks the similarities and the difficulties. So one field of research for which the framework from Poole, Nieborg, and Duffy, and I was thinking we can call it the P&D, no, Poole, Nieborg, the P&D approach, but it sounds a bit like a party drug, like do we take ecstasy or P&D? So I'm not so sure. So the framework of them can be used to indeed understand the unfolding of a new governance model that we now see happening in the tech industry in China. And this is really interesting what's happening there, actually. It involves the disappearance of Jack Ma. It involves really control measures. But what's going on here? It's actually an attempt from governance to develop a new governance model towards the tech industry, something we are looking for in the European Union as well. So, and I think your book can actually help to unpack that. This already brings in one question before I move to my other questions to conclude. I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on how you navigate this tension between Western theory versus non-Western examples. So how do you make it truly equal, actually? I see you struggle in the book, and I'm struggling with this myself. So this is not a critique, but it's more an open question. Now, finally, a few questions, 3. The first pertains to aesthetics. Coming from it, and this won't surprise you either, coming from cultural studies, I'm familiar with studies of media text as well as audiences, and audiences beyond metrics and datafication. In your book, I see quite little attention to the aesthetic and affective dimension, be they short movies, images, text, or sounds, or indeed publics. Now, I know your book is on production, but at the same time, you also argue, rightly so, that production, content, maker, and audience are all blurred. So the cultural products themselves are hardly analyzed, nor do they feature very much in your suggestions for future directions. Now, this is sometimes happening, it seems to me, in new media studies, in which methods belonging to legacy media, which I find a rather problematic term that seems to serve to foreground the assumed newness of new media, are deemed insufficient, and that we should all go with native methods. Now, you do not do this in your book, but the question remains, what about aesthetics? What about affect? Second, regarding the question of possible alternatives, and here's an overlap with Anna actually. She also asked this, because we now see this binary, right? Like the US platforms and the Chinese platforms. I believe in the top 50 of platforms, I was GAFAM versus BAT, right? Like Google, versus Baidu, And the EU is lacking. I believe in the top 50, it's only Spotify. The rest is either Chinese or American, if I'm right. So building on your study, what kind of counter tactics do you envision? Is there a way to move beyond the platformization of the cultural industries as we see now, not towards an analog alternative, but do something else, do something new? And what could that something else be? But Anna, I think, was also asking this. And the final and smaller question, when referring to inequalities, you always refer to the identity labels race, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. And it's an old school question. So what happened to class? How comes that class is not included in this list? And I must admit, this question actually pops up a lot in my mind when witnessing current identity debates. So buy the book. It's great. Thank you so much.
Wow, this is great, Jeroen. A major part of your talk, just an advertisement for a book. So I can't be more happy. And then a number of pointed questions. David.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words. It's great to be virtually back in Amsterdam, so we can just openly make references to drugs. This is great. P&D. I'm going to tell this here in Canada, and then people will look at me and probably suggest to fire me after that. So to take your first question about Western theory versus these localized case studies, that's such a, yeah, we struggled quite a bit with that. I think what helped me is to go to a certain level of abstraction, in the theory. And if you sort of go high enough, if you can say it like that, you arrive at a level of abstraction where there are similarities. When you talk about, sort of my expertise would be markets economics, then there are, I had conversations with and read Mark Steinberg's book on platform economy, Japanese platforms, Asian markets, etc. And he unpacks this genealogy of the terms of platforms that definitely had a history way before US-based scholars and economists picked up on it, in Japan particularly, and he's done more work on it recently, which is fantastic. But his argument is that it has a longer history, but not like a major shift in the thinking of how we currently think about the economics. So for many of these questions, like we had to dig into a bit more into infrastructure questions and debate about infrastructures and governance, etc. If you go high up enough, there is a body of theory of decades long that really generative to think through this question and then start applying them to these specific cases. So I think that helped us to steer away from, because at the end of the day, when you think about platform economics, if you go to this, again, multi-sided markets, it's like this is a tricky thing to say correct, but it's a very generic way of explaining this market system. I talk myself into a corner here. So let's move on to your second question. You talk about aesthetics and affect. Yeah, this was sort of I think, and Thomas can jump in, almost like also a pragmatic question, because we had so many, balls in the air, juggling, that like we're aware of it. It's not my major expertise. There are so many people probably like yourself who are so better positioned. You should do what you're good at sometimes also as an academic. So I think this was a very conscious decision, at least on my part. If somebody says, oh, you have to do the book all over again, would you want to include that? It's like, I hope others can work with our insights to do that. It's not for a lack of interest. I don't know if Thomas, do you agree with this, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we try to do is obviously focus on production, right? And Jeroen already mentioned that. And I think that's how we try to delimit what we're doing. And so I think for us, the question of sort of audiences, reception, aesthetics, we sort of put to the side to have this focus. And that then allows us to create, well, this framework, which I think if you would introduce other questions into this framework, it would just collapse or explode, and it wouldn't have this consistency. So that's kind of a pragmatic choice, but I think you need to make those choices to actually build a theoretical framework. Can I just respond to one other point you were making? I think that's a really complicated issue, actually, about sort of the Western theories, sort of the non-Western examples. And to some extent, I agree with you, David, is that what we're doing is obviously try to look at these processes at a very high level of abstraction at certain moments, right? And then they actually apply, I guess, across cultural contexts. But at the same time, I do think that a lot of our concerns in the book, especially also in the second half of the book, are sort of very Western and very informed by Western theory. And I don't think you can escape that. I think you just have to work with the theory that's out there, at least available to us in the languages we read and speak. And that's what we did. But the moment, we actually read the work that's available in English by Chinese scholars or Indian scholars or people working on Japan, we immediately notice, I think, friction. So in that sense, I do think that it's something we haven't really resolved. And that's open, for further research for others to, say, maybe it doesn't work here this way. Maybe it's slightly different. Sorry, David, continue.
No, I agree. I mean, these are the questions and conversations we want to provoke, also amongst ourselves, but with scholars like yourself, because I think it's pretty clear that we want to be upfront. I hope we are upfront where we're coming from in many senses, theoretically, institutionally, etc. So yeah, I think what has helped me is to have these conversations, of course, with our students. And our students here in Toronto are so diverse, and they show us, or me or us, all these apps and platforms that are so far outside of sort of even my lived experience. So those kinds of conversations help. I think there's an interesting tension, or I don't know if it's in tension, between the first half of the book and the second half of the book, right? These institutional issues, you can go, arguably, I feel, to a level of abstraction. That's much harder to do, I think, in the second half of the book, which those questions are much, meshier and complex and difficult, at least in my mind. I want to pick up on one issue you raised as well, class. I thought, being a sort of a fake Marxist on weekdays and holidays, that that was slightly there, even implicitly. It should have been there with the whole question of labor. It should be more front and center. But yeah, I think it's that question of class depends so much also which intellectual community you're in. I think
I agree, David. It is actually very much there in the labor chapter, and there's a lot about inequality in the book and a lot about power, which is actually about class. So in that sense, it's a bit a nitty-picky point of me. Like, but I sometimes think when people connect the issue of identity politics and exclude class, I find that sometimes, which you don't do in the book, but sometimes you do it when you talk about identity politics in the book. But it's really a minor point, so that's more the thing. So I just think I would make a plea that I also think if we start listing labels, but I also think it's still incomplete, right? Because there's also disability, there's homelessness, there's so there's also a problem there, actually. Well, what happened to the abbreviation with the GLTBQA plus things?
Yeah, and what I've seen is, like, I'm sort of in two worlds. Canada, which is sort of halfway the US, halfway Europe, right? So the way my colleagues talk about class, I feel, is very different than and you're hinting at that as well. I don't have a good answer to this because it's so hard, especially coming out of Europe into Canada, to speak about that in a way that keeps everybody happy and on the same page. The last thing that all of you touched upon is this question of alternatives. I don't have a really good answer to that, other than to hopefully think about alternative in those different stages of production. That's what I'm coming back to. I think alternatives in terms of creation are very different than alternatives in moments of distribution, right? The distribution part is so centralized, it seems, or it feels like. Marketing and monetization are quite different. So I think once we start having that conversation, what could be alternatives? I hope those conversations break down in those sort of 3-4 phases where we can think through where do platforms, they are about distribution, but increasingly tools are platformized and tools are integrated into the platform. TikTok is the tool. Is that, what does that mean? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Can you do stuff outside of TikTok, create stuff? Of course you can, but do you want to, do you need to, etc. So if we start having those alternative questions, I hope we can be specific on that. And that's all I can say, other than some obligatory, open source or hopefully sort of publicly funded tools and platforms. That would be great. Public service media in Canada and the Netherlands, I'm incredibly happy that still exists. I hope it will exist forever because you could see the value of it. And I think there could be, I'm not a politician, obviously, but to me, it would not be weird for like a European Union or regional or governments to invest in tools and to invest in distribution tools, just like you invest in public service media, you can invest in those. It would not be weird to me, but I can see the Twitter mentions when this would be suggested by a politician that they wouldn't survive for 2 minutes.
Yeah, maybe to just add to that. So indeed, you both raised this question of alternatives and platforms and sort of dominant platforms. And one thing that immediately came to mind for me was also sort of what is happening in the news industry. Right? So yes, platforms have become quite dominant in the distribution and to some extent in monetization of news production. But at the same time, you can also see a counter movement. And that's not a counter movement of alternative platforms, but it's a counter movement of news organizations that are succeeding and putting a lot of effort into attracting online subscribers. And in some cases, actually are quite successful in doing so. So I would say there you clearly have an alternative mode of distribution online, an alternative mode of monetization, which allows you for a lot of platform independence. And obviously, that's an alternative that's not open to every news organization. Mostly sort of the larger newspapers, television channels have that open. But I would say that's also an alternative to platforms, to platformization. And then maybe one other point, and this goes back to Anna's earlier question about these dominant platforms, right? To what extent would you say what we say in the book is actually applicable to other types of platforms, not the dominant ones. And I think one thing which we also touched upon in this book, but also in an earlier book on the platform society, is that we do think there is a division to be made between these dominant platforms and other types of sort of so-called platform services, given that these dominant ones actually provide what we call the infrastructural foundations of online economies, exchanges, and so on. So obviously your work has been quite fundamental here in actually pointing that out, right? Is that particular services by Facebook or by Google have become infrastructural for the rest of the web, right? They rely on payment services, advertising networks, identification services, and so on to actually operate online. So in that sense, yes, we can look beyond sort of these dominant platforms, but I do think that if you're studying sort of what is happening to the cultural industries or what is happening maybe to other sectors, which you might be interested in, for example, hospitality or transport or health and so on, you do need to start, I guess, with the dominant ones and figure out sort of how are they infrastructurally and economically positioned within this economy. And then obviously, yeah, you can ask follow-up questions about other types of platforms and how, well, what we call complementers are operating in relation to these platforms. But I do think sort of the focus on these dominant ones is very important for also, political, economic reasons. But Anne, we're responding to your questions. You haven't been able to speak last quarter of now. Maybe any thoughts you have at this point, and then I'll turn to the questions of the audience.
No, it was also, I think, in line with Jeroen's questions, to what extent the kind of like frameworks or concepts or theories that were used of, like either whether they come from software studies or business studies, right? They all inherently focus on these big platforms and US platform. So it was a similar like open question, I think, to or invitation to all of us as platform researchers to look also for the specificity. And I think this is also what you outline in the book, right? Like it's like the difficulty of navigating the specificity versus making like, you know, a general framework or a general platform theory. So also, in a way, a case for these grounded, maybe empirical studies to try to tease out, right, these specificities in doing so. But I think this is the general thing that we as platform researchers, right, are trying to look for. And the question then, which is also an open question, how do we then translate, right, the kind of work that comes out of either different disciplines? I'm thinking of, you know, urban geography, which also does a lot of interesting platform research, or other related fields, like what can we learn? So this is also a call for maybe even more interdisciplinary research, right? Like in this context, within this book, in my own work, also in my work with Fernando van der Vlist, for example, it is about combining these different theoretical conceptual apparatus. And the question is then also, one can never be exhaustive, but, you know, which other disciplines could we possibly also learn from, you know? So not even a question of disciplines, but also what other maybe industries or countries, because I'm also thinking about when talking about indeed like app stores, which you also discuss in your book. As you are very well aware, and I'm also looking forward to your future work on this, the different logics on which these platforms operate, right? So in the US or even the European context, we can talk about, you know, we have an app store, and if you look for it, you find all kinds of apps in there constituting the app ecosystem. But this doesn't even work, right, with most of the giant Chinese platforms, because they use mini apps, right? So this different operational logic, and do then these kind of like ideas or concepts, like, can we even speak of an app ecosystem then, if it's, you know, if it's not built on top of the platform, but maybe fully integrated within, right? So what are the different concepts or insights that we can then use, or do we need to shift our vocabulary, which is not an argument for introducing more and more concepts, right, but more to be attuned of these differences within.
I would love to respond quickly to that question of what Jeroen earlier said, like promiscuity, which I'm going to appropriate this hard. That's a great term to use every day. I think that our scholarship, not to sort of boost ourselves up, because that's not necessary either, but I think many of us are much more open to be in dialogue with these other fields, and your work, Anne, is such a good example of that. And I feel that some other fields are not always necessarily, I don't know if I should say return the favor, but Thomas and I recently had conversations about this as well, where like the field of business studies can be somewhat resistant, as you're very well aware of, and with engaging with our work. And we're very happy and eager. So sometimes it feels a bit weird. You feel like an 8-year-old, and like, oh, please look at our work. Please look at our work. And they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. So yes, we should remain doing that, because it leads to very relevant work, I think. But on the other hand, the call for interdisciplinary work, I think we've done a pretty good job. I feel like. Feel free to disagree. The other question about cultural production is, I find that in most fields like business studies, software studies, what is missing is a focus on cultural production. So you're absolutely right. The dominant focus is on the big ones, right? The big platforms. But within those big platforms, I think the complementers are always seen as complementers, but there is sort of a massive lack. And that this is acknowledged. And there are a couple of papers in business studies where it just said literally, we do not know anything about the media industries or culture industries. So yes, there is a focus on the big platforms, and it would be helpful and generative to shift to smaller ones. But let's not forget that even within those who study big platforms, cultural production is sort of typically, left by the wayside.
Great. Yeah. So I fully agree with the one thing I just wanted to add to David about us sort of engaging with different fields, which I think all of us have been doing in this panel, is that for me, that's also what makes it so interesting and enjoyable to do this type of research, because we constantly discover, oh, this is actually a field which I didn't know yet. And they've been actually talking about similar issues, but in slightly different language. And we can actually learn a lot here. And we can use that in how we study this. So what I want to do now is turn to the questions of the audience. So throughout our discussion and presentation, there are a number of people who have commented. So I just want to read some of these comments and questions to you, and then do a round of responses. So I'm just going to read all of them. Because otherwise, if we all say something, we'll stay here until 7 o'clock, and we need to stop at 6:30. So during the first part, Darsana, who's actually an old RMA student who is now at University of Toronto, remarked that she was wondering if we saw any examples of guilds or unions becoming more important in cultural industries, and what this implies for the idea of individualization, which we also emphasize. So how do these emerging forms of organization actually connect or stack up to this mechanism of individualization? David Craig, which I already mentioned before when he talked about quality control and brand control, remarks, and this is actually just a contribution to the discussion we were having. As for quality control, there are reports of upward 3,000 talent managers at YouTube alone working with their most profitable talent to boost engagement, prevent questionable practices that may risk the platform, violate norms of their online community, and of course lose money. So this really goes to the point that Anne was also making before. Well, they do care very much about the types of content that are being shared, and invest a lot in not just infrastructurally enabling that, but obviously also in terms of the people they employ to manage that. And Reine Rustema, former colleague of ours at the UVA, asked the question about the long tail. Has it gone out of fashion in our thinking about this? It has long been cherished as the main distinction between legacy and platform content. And now on YouTube, there is something for everyone, and then at the very end of the long tail. So what do we make of the long tail? And there's actually discussion about the long tail in the book. So I think David can say something about it in a moment. And then Tamara van Kessel, a friend of ours, remarks on our discussion on aesthetics. And she says, is aesthetics necessarily mainly a matter concerning the consumption side of things? Which you could maybe conclude from my response to Jeroen's question. The graphic design chosen by platform often expresses a certain functional aesthetics, right? Which seems very standardized. Is it not also part of a platform's normative power? So that's, I think, a very good and insightful remark. So let's make a final round of comments on the basis of these questions and remarks, or anything else you would like to bring to the table. So maybe we'll start with Jeroen, then to Anne, and then David. Jeroen. you're like, oh wow, I'm being caught in
I'm
the
totally in
headlines.
shock because I thought these questions were actually for the both authors, so for David and Thomas. So I'm now totally in so I pick up. I'd like to pick up on the last question. Yes, I do. Okay, let me do two questions. I think the long tail from Ryan de Rustema. I think how I read your book is actually that you show how the long tail is critiqued a lot and is indeed not happening that much as people thought about the increased fragmentation. So there's actually a lot of very marginal practices and still a lot of dominant practices. So while we believe in the past you only had because I'm come from music, in the past we had George Michael and Michael Jackson and Madonna, and now we have like 20,000 different stars. It's not that much the case. That's how I read your book, that it's not so much the case. I like Tamara's point about aesthetics, because yes, I agree. I do think that the interface of apps and the way these look are very important, very normative, and this is also about affordances, right? So they allow you to do things, they steer you to do things, they guide you to do things, and they produce a certain image. For that reason, actually, I come back to my China thing. Chinese websites are usually extreme, and I'm talking about websites, but also often apps. They're to me, to my taste, they are super, super messy. They're very loud. There's too much there. And there is an interesting study to do there, I feel, like what that says about different localities and different interfaces. So this is my...
Nice, great, thank you. Anne.
So I'll respond to David Craig's, like, it's not even a question, but his like notion that this notion of quality control is also not only guarded by the platform itself, but also by these external talent managers, which is also like the same with moderation, right? Where lots of the work is actually being outsourced by these platforms. And so I would just maybe translate David Craig's comment into like a call for more empirical research into this subject, right? Like, what are these talent managers doing, and can we read these guidelines of kind of like suggestions of what the platform, you know, is asking in terms of quality content? So how can we, so more of an open suggestion of how can we translate, you know, these kind of documentation about the practices of these workers and the guidelines that they have to stick to better understand these, you know, these tensions or dynamics between platforms and cultural producers. So basically a call for even more empirical platform research.
Great, thank you, David.
Yeah, I'm so happy that Jeroen picked up on that conversation in the long tail discussion. I think the long tail, sometimes it's just better to speak of a power law dynamic or Pareto principles, or these economic concepts that have been existing for a really long time. And somebody at Wired wrote a book about it, and it sounds super, you know, instantly makes sense. And those books are both the best and the worst, because a whole generation of managers, I feel like, have been like inoculated with this idea of like, oh, a long tail, woohoo. And then really soon after, studies came out that gave, what are we talking about? So in these days, I would say, you know, the hat is, the hits are bigger and the tail is longer. So in that sense, yeah, the long tail very much exists, but you know, who are the winners, who are the losers, who are in the hat, who are in the tail, etc. So that book, you know, it's great to use in teaching, because when you read it, everybody should read it, and then you feel like the author is right, and then you dig into it. So in that sense, it's very helpful to think through these issues. And the last thing about the question about what David Craig, so I like the sadistic aspect of this, that I can say and he cannot talk back. This is great. Hi, David. You know, it comes back to this question of what is quality and quality control. And I think it feels like, if you compare it to media industries of decades ago, it's this push and pull question as well, right? So in the old days, people went out and talent scouts maybe went out, and now we have, if you say 30,000 people, or you have 30,000 quality controllers, or you have a population. But for me, the question is who passed that point, right? Who passed the point of now you're in? Now you're part of the Creator Academy. How do you arrive at that point? And up until that point, there is a massive steering effect. There is a lot of people are pushed out either by the algorithms or by indirectly, or they don't like the aesthetics of the app in the first place, right? So it's a sort of this self-selection and hardcore pruning of a population. And then from that arrives a creator population. So, and then we can debate that pool, is that quality? What does that mean that that pool has the best YouTube material, right? So I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's important for us to realize, like, where is the cutoff point? How do they arrive at that point? How can we study them once they're in that pool of quality creators? And what does that mean? And what's the job of those folks? And I think David Craig has a much better sense than I do. And this very process is, of course, very different for every platform. How Apple deals with apps is very different than YouTube deals with creators. And for each of those platforms, having better insight in that process is key. And I feel like we don't. Like for YouTube, we have a much better sense, but then TikTok seems to be doing it slightly different again, et cetera, et cetera. So to get hold of that process, the cutoff points, to make that explicit, because I feel those decision points are typically not that explicit. They're purposely fuzzy and vague.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we're nearing the end of the session. I just had one particular thought when just reflecting back on what we've discussed. And one thing I think, which maybe we haven't talked so much about, and which is kind of difficult, I think, to talk about, is how incredibly dynamic sort of these relations are, right? How they are constantly subject to change. And we've tried to capture that in the book under this notion of platform evolution, to indicate that the platforms, which many of these culture industries are starting to rely on, are subject to these constant changes, which creates precarity. But I would say that more generally, just the entire cultural industry in this platform era is highly dynamic, subject to change. And I mean, to just mention a couple of examples, and which I think also sort of change the way we think about the issues we discuss in this session. If you think about the news industry, for example, I mean, the news industry around 2013, 14 seemed well on its way to be very much platformatized, right? Where increasingly news would be distributed through Facebook, Twitter, and so on. But we actually see quite a different development recently. Paywalls being created, and news organizations quite successfully developing a different business model based on online subscriptions. So I think there are different sort of avenues forward. Another example I was thinking about, which we haven't talked about at all, which we do talk a little bit about in the book, is Netflix. So, and the television landscape, right? So if you would think about from the logic of our book, you would say, oh, well, the television industry might actually be absorbed by YouTube. Which is actually very much the question whether that's happening. If we look at Netflix or Disney Plus or Amazon, they're investing quite successfully in the development of original content and very much operating not as platforms, but actually as more traditional media companies producing original content and then selling that through subscriptions to end users. So here again, I think it's not the development of these various industries is not something that's predetermined. It's something that is actually constantly subject to change, and depends also very much on the culture producers themselves and the choices they make, the strategic choices that are made, and of course also on how end users engage with this. And then maybe one final thing which we touched on, but maybe that's something indeed for much further research. Jeroen talks about the Chinese platforms and how they sometimes seem too much, right? Too full, too blinky, and so on. And we also noticed that, obviously. And one thing I think to think about is the status of these platforms, which is also, again, something which is very much subject to change. So we know the US model of the platform simply as sort of a mediator, as something that doesn't really affect what is being exchanged through the platform, or at least argues that it doesn't influence what is being exchanged, to, on the other side of the equation, thinking about platforms very much as media companies that do edit what is being exchanged. And the Chinese platform companies are often actually, by law, considered to be media companies. So a very different model. And I think recently we've seen that different model, that model of considering platforms partly also as media companies, becoming more and more important, also especially in the European context. So again, I think an area where we can see substantial changes, which might affect very much how this industry is developing and how platforms are involved in these industries. So those would be my final thoughts. Maybe David, do you want to add anything to this, or are you happy with where we ended?
I'm very happy, and thanks
Great.
again for coming, attending, and thanks Jeroen and Anne for your fantastic questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you everyone for coming, and indeed that concludes this panel.